So, to add to this series on visual language and how to tell your story visually, I wanted to dive into the world of visual aesthetics, which I learned when I was a film student at USC from one of the kind of premier people who talks about all this stuff named Bruce Black, who wrote this book called The Visual Story. And there is no way for me to cover the amount of information that he covers, and his lectures were amazing over the entire semester. But you can read his book, and what's wonderful about his book is that at the end of each chapter, he lists a bunch of movies for you to watch to get a sense of how these visual aesthetics were planned and put in place for these various movies. So you can kind of see it in action. The overview of what he's talking about are what he calls the basic visual components, which are space, line and shape, tone, color, movement, and rhythm. And these visual components exist in every image. It's based on kind of art history and art theory, but he makes it make sense in terms of the cinematic image. And I will do a very poor representation of some of these elements. And so today I'm going to talk about space and line and shape. So space is, as it says here, the physical space in front of the camera. So that's your set. And how that space is represented on screen. So sometimes you'll look at the space with your own eye and be like, oh, okay, this is how everything looks. But then when you look on the frame on camera, the relationship of the objects looks different. You might have to kind of move things around to get it to look better on screen. And then the size of the screen itself, this is what we talked about last time in terms of aspect ratio. And then line and shape is quite simply the line and shapes formed by actors or objects, and also movement in the frame. So space is kind of most simply put, we're talking about kind of how to represent depth on a two-dimensional flat image. And there are Bruce Block goes into other aspects of space, but I think the most kind of important ones are deep space versus flat space, which is how do you create a sense of depth in your frame and whether you want to. And all of this depends on what's right for your story. So it's easier to talk about this when looking at an image. This is clearly an example of deep space. So you have this vanishing perspective point. You don't always have to have a vanishing point on the frame. Sometimes that can be off frame. But the important point or part of this vanishing point is that it draws the eye. So even if it's off frame, your audience's eye is going to kind of drift towards that vanishing point over and over and over again. So if you place your character somewhere other than where the vanishing point is drawing the eye, you're going to be forcing your audience to compete their attention between whatever's happening with the character and where their eye naturally is being pulled because of the depth in the frame. And there are a lot of reasons, because obviously this is simply a two-dimensional image, but it looks three-dimensional because it has what we call depth cues. And the easiest way to think about that is the fact that you have something that you know intellectually is the same exact size. Like, for example, these railroad planks. You know that those wooden planks are exactly the same size, but repeated over the frame in smaller and smaller diminishing images repeated over and over again. You also have these parallel lines of the train tracks. converging at the vanishing point. The trees and the rocks don't give us as strong depth cues other than the fact that they all kind of converge with the train tracks and the railroad planks. And so this is what allows us to create a sense of depth. And this is something you could even draw. You know, when you draw those three-dimensional boxes, you know, it gives a sense of depth because those lines are kind of converging in places. So a great example of using deep space in a movie is Run Lola Run. And you can see the archways and these columns. They give this kind of repetitive depth cues over and over and over again that kind of converge. And guess where that vanishing point is? It's directly behind Lola. So our eye is going towards exactly what the director wants us to look at, which is her running. The opposite of deep space is flat space. So this is where obviously everything is kind of flat to camera. The actors are flat to camera, the wall is flat to camera, the bench is flat to camera. And you see this phrase affinity within frame. And what that means is that everything has kind of a sameness, whereas with these, even though these are the same wooden planks, because they are smaller and smaller and smaller, what they're doing is creating a lot of contrast. And that contrast creates intensity, whereas where we have affinity, it's a little bit more comfortable. It's not such an intense image. So, you know, you don't necessarily want to have Run Lola Run in deep space all the time. And there are moments in that film where it goes flat. So you can see here the image in Run Lola Run goes flat and uses flat space here for these kind of interludes that we have. If you haven't seen this film, it's one of my favorites. So yeah, so there's a combination of deep space, which we see here, and then flat space here, depending on kind of what part of the story we're telling and why. You'll have to watch it to think about why. Why did the director choose to use deep space and flat space and all that stuff? Here's another example of flat space. Again, you don't have to use deep space for intensity. This is a pretty intense shot in terms of content from Taxi Driver. But again, visually, those depth cues create just kind of a physical intensity for the audience in looking at it that flat space doesn't have. Again, deep space versus flat space. Really what we're talking about is camera angle. You know, where are you positioning your camera in order to tell your story? And what does your camera position do to the objects in front of it? Here's another example of something that could be deep space, but because of the lighting, it is actually a pretty flat image. So you know we're in a parking lot, and you do have these repetitive lights, but because they've turned off the larger lights kind of around here, these kind of runway strip lights are pretty small in comparison to the rest of this image, and they don't create such a strong draw. So our eye is really just drawn to this car, which is flat to camera, and these panels are flat to camera, and we're only lighting a few of them. So there isn't that strong kind of runway vanishing point. And, you know, if anything, our eye is drawn to this kind of above row of lights, which is right above the car. So even though this could be, if we lit it differently, a deep space image. It is actually, in fact, a flat space image. So again, lighting, angle, all of these things can force depth cues or not. So it's up to you. So again, where you position your characters. Here we've got Charlton Heston in the back, kind of where the vanishing point of these, uh, you know, boxes or storage units are going, and it's kind of drawing your eye away from this guy that's at the front of the frame. Um, but he's also lighter in his clothing, so it that also draws the attention. So there's kind of an interesting back and forth as you look at this image. Uh, Touch of Evil, again, you can force a person to kind of become deep space or create that vanishing point with your low angle shots. But interestingly enough, soft focus or, a shallow depth of field negates depth cues. So here we could have something that would draw our eye to the left of frame and, with all these people lined up. But because of this very specific depth of field right on our main character, our eye directly goes to him. And so it forces us only to look at him when there's a lot of stuff that we could be looking at. So again, it could be a deep space shot, but instead it's actually flat space. All right, so line and shape, again, let's take a look at some imagery. All right, Natural Born Killers. A lot of people know this film. So when you think about kind of the lines of this movie and you start to look at kind of the images and how it's composed, you can really see that Dutch angle and all these diagonal lines cutting through the frame. And so why does this work for this story? Because these people are completely unhinged, right? So everything is off kilter. And, it seems like an oversimplification. And sometimes when you think about these things or see them, you're like, oh God, like, duh. But hopefully, if you use these tools well, your audience will feel it, but they won't necessarily understand it or kind of consciously recognize it. And you're really tapping into this kind of subconscious, visceral experience of watching a movie instead of being like, hey, look at us, we're doing crazy angles. You don't want it to read as obvious, but sometimes when we're looking back at these things, you're like, oh, of course, of course, of course you would do this. Lawrence in Arabia, we have, again, movement can create lines. So looking between these two characters creates a line across the frame. Lines don't have to be straight. So we've got, squiggle lines throughout the desert. We can also have shapes. So if you kind of squint at this, because of the contrast of the darker colors at the top and bottom, you could maybe say it's a cylinder. It's mostly a rectangle. And again, the shape that we create on frame depends on our camera angle. So if we change that a little bit, and again, using the contrast of a darker color in the cup, now we could have a circle or we could have an oval in the frame. So everything that we put, as soon as we put something in front of camera, we have created a sense of depth, whether you want to or not. We have created a sense of line and shape, whether you want to or not. So these are the choices that you can make as a director to try and control what shapes and lines and space and how your audience is understanding the image or reading the image essentially. So here's another shot from Lawrence of Arabia where again the eye trace looking between these 3 points creates a shape. It creates a triangle. Here's obviously a clear shape, square, but we also are using it with deep space because you have these repetitive light sconces getting smaller and smaller, the running lines kind of all converging at the center of where we're supposed to be looking. And if you remember the movie, this is also rotating as well. So there's a lot going on that we can't quite appreciate as much in a still image, but you still have the strong sense of, kind of zeroing in the vanishing point that's kind of cut off at the end, but it's still strong enough to kind of draw our eye, and then the square shape and the rotating and all that. Okay, Lord of the Rings. Very clear. Mostly, again, you're kind of squinting. Very clearly a circular, heavily circular imagery. Here we do have a couple of counterpoints with the rug and the chairs, but circle, 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 right? I love this image from Lord of the Rings because you can even see that the plants are circular. There are other plants out there that we could have that would be, star shaped or, differently shaped, that other than a circle. And, we have these very circular flowers. And again, these are things that are chosen for specific reasons to help tell your story and to help underscore the visual themes that you're going for. Orcs are all very circular. Gollum is very, very circular. Even this, get off the road moment in Fellowship of the Ring, that kind of warping dolly zoom that they have here has this kind of rotating circular moment. So so much stuff is circular. The only people who really aren't circular are the elves, which again, story-wise makes sense because they want to keep themselves apart from the perils of man and orcs and hobbits and all this stuff. And they've got the pointy ears and the pointy jewelry. But, why is this shape important for the story? Because it's called Lord of the Rings, right? It's all about the ring, the one ring, and circles everywhere for days. So, Peter Jackson, totally let me know if this was not in your mind, but somebody at some point had to think, Lord of the Rings, what shape should we go with in our production design? Trapezoid? No, I don't think so. Yeah. So Taxi Driver, again, we saw this image, very rectangular, very boxy, flat space in this image. And, this is a very kind of rigid character in many ways. And don't forget, light can also create lines and shapes and all kinds of things. So it's a lot of fun to start thinking about what your story is going to look like when you've got a script and you can start applying things like, okay, well, what's going to go on my frame and what are the shapes that seem to thematically connect with my characters and are they unhinged? And so we want to have something a little bit off kilter and do some diagonal lines across the frame, or we want to have use deep space, or we don't want to use deep space ever, or we want to have a combination of deep space and flat space, and we're going to use those moments very, very specifically so that when there's that aha moment, we're now in deep space, and these are subtle ways, again, when you're watching movies and television that help underscore the story. And the reason why this is important is that, as I was mentioning with the 6 basic visual components, they exist in your frame whether you want them there or not, whether you've chosen them or not. These 6 visual components exist. So if you have not controlled it, or if you have chosen poorly, then you might have something that actually contradicts your the story that you're trying to tell, or the moment that you're trying to tell. So, these are things that can can really help or hurt your story. And like I was saying, the deep space is one of them, where that vanishing point is going to be drawing your eye. And if your characters are falling in love over here, you want to make sure that your audience is in that moment with them, falling in love with them, not looking at this really deep space vanishing point that looks beautiful, but is calling away attention to this massive story point. So anyways, I will be back with more on some of the other visual components. This is fun stuff. This is my favorite stuff. But it's definitely something that I've been working on and have not mastered in the years since I was a film student, and am always trying to incorporate and figure out how to tell my story visually when I go into production.